Hello, everyone. It's been a minute since we've all been here together on one of these salons online. I think the last one was what was it, Nico's or Jim's from like November of last year or something like that. So it's been a couple months. I've done a couple things in person, of course, but this online one, it's been a minute. So how's everyone doing?
Doing great, Addy.
We're all real good. We're good to have the gang back together. Jess, Michael, Dugan. We got Mukund. We got how do you say your name? Sajith?
It's Digest. Yep.
Sajith. Yeah, and I know you've been on many times, so I'm very thankful for that.
It's nice to get the ball rolling again with
Yes.
this because everything else, as I'm sure you're going to say, like a lot of things are kind of picking up steam, and it's hard to
Yep.
believe it's already March.
Oh
But
yeah.
here we are,
Yeah, it's March 11th. I'm surprised it still feels like it's January and I'm like, where the
right?
hell did all the time go? Right?
It's like, and this is the time of year where it's like I'm thinking about I'm there, and then especially if you're traveling and like doing other stuff, and you have like your mind's a few months out, but then like physically
Yeah.
you're in this, and like spring is happening. I don't know where it is where
Yeah.
you are right now, but like
No,
spring is
for me
here.
the
So
last
yeah.
frankly the last 2 years have been a bit of a blur, especially last year. Like last year there was just so much happening that like I never really took a moment to be like, "Oh, this is this thing that's happening around me," and it was just I was just always on the run, moving. So it's
Yeah.
been very strange. But speaking of very strange things and all that, the presentation that we have today is something that many of you have already seen, in bits and pieces at some point. You've seen glimpses of it on, some of my Substack posts or on, the salons and all those kinds of things. You've definitely seen it at some point. And something I think is really interesting here is this story did not start with me. It's not going to end with me, and I'm just sort of someone kind of going on about it right now at the moment in the present. This is a way older idea than me or any of us, and it's going to continue to grow way beyond any of us unless we solve longevity, which would be kind of cool. But there's some really interesting stuff here. So I think we should, if you can see the slide, right? This first slide here.
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, you can
No,
see
we
the
can see
slide.
it. Good. Yeah, we can see everything.
Okay, okay, cool. Just making sure because the connection is a little spotty. All right. The mind as its own pharmacy. Now, this is not the first time I've talked about this specific thing. I actually just did like, a week or two ago in San Francisco at the Inventor's House, the residency one. I did a little presentation there on some vision work. And then on this, Andres from Curai was there. It was a lot of fun. Um, but I'm not going to give any more details. I think all of you already have enough context to kind of piece together a little bit of what I'm getting at. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm just going to move on to the next slide. So what you see here is that through just thought alone, perception, whatever labels we use to describe this idea of thought and perception, we were able to induce an anaphylactic response in rats. Now this can be life threatening. This is a very severe and let's put emphasis on measurable physical phenomena in the body, right? It's a little hard to just think it's something else. Like there's clearly something that's happening as far as we can tell. And you can get this through Pavlovian conditioning, which is just conditioning some kind of sensory stimuli or linguistic stimuli with, say, the allergen in this case. And so just through thought and perception alone, we were able to induce, arguably pretty harmful state of physiology, just like that, right? Um, Next one. All right. This is another one. We can modify, this thing that we call the immune system, which is extremely important to the way that we live and survive every day. The immune system, in a sense, is this sort of decentralized system in our body is about differentiating what is the self and what is not the self, right? That's one way to kind of phrase it. And now you can see here that just once again through placebo, through thought and perception alone, you're able to modify your immune system just like that. Pretty weird, right? Little weird, um, but very interesting. Um, so here's another one on analgesics, right? So there's this opioid remifentanil. Now I'm no MD, I'm no physician, so maybe someone here who has more experience with this stuff can speak on it. But very interesting that you can get these positive effects, these sort of pain relieving effects of these things through just expectation. And what is expectation? Well, it's the way you're thinking about something. Expectation is just another form of marketing and branding. It's an instruction on how to perceive and interact with the object or the thing in front of you, right? That's sort of the basis of placebo, and I would go as far as say is placebo and marketing are basically getting at the same thing as well. So I'm just going to go through a couple other studies just to set the context for this, and then we can go back afterwards, right? So here's one that I actually really like, right? So if you look into this for a second, all right. So I don't know how many of you have had experience with breast cancer, or know people that have. Um, it's not fun. It's very painful, and even the medications and treatments people will undergo for this is, there's never really a guarantee. And sometimes you can put yourself through all that pain, and sometimes you don't even make it out, right? So it's kind of, it's very sad and tragic, right? I mean, it's not a comfortable thing. And what's really interesting here, right, is as we think about this is, okay, this is a pretty big medical issue. And then now you're saying, okay, they can undergo some kind of breast biopsy or lumpectomy or whatever, and they can have a 15-minute pre-surgery hypnosis session, and this can reduce at least their subjective feeling and measures of pain and associated kinds of qualia, right? Wait, just got out. Let me add him back on. So you can read this here, and I'll have the slides up. Everybody can take a look at all these different measures of things that were modified from that. But now imagine, hey, you don't have to take propofol or lidocaine, or you can at least take a much smaller amount, and you can get the same kind of effect, right? And if you take less of that, does that mean you also get to sort of filter out some of the negative side effects, right? Because everything, seems to have a side effect to a degree. So this is pretty interesting, right? Now the next one. Now I actually found out about this through somebody named Michael Levin, who I'm sure all of you have probably heard of it at this point. But this is sort of this idea of hypnodermatology, and essentially through hypnotic training. Which, by the way, how are people actually undergoing hypnotic training and experiences? They're using language. They're using these things called words, right? These squiggles that you see on the screen, these arbitrary squiggles. Turns out if you kind of coordinate and pattern them together, you can tap into this thing that we call meaning and structure, right? Really interesting. And it's not just this thing that we call words, like what you see on the screen. It's the sort of sonic representation of it, right? There are these sounds I'm making from my face and my neck, which would be utterly meaningless to someone that wasn't trained on English. It would just sound like sounds, right? Like any random sound, it wouldn't have that same kind of meaning. And you also have to think, as a quick thought experiment, we're talking about all this stuff about hypnosis and placebo, about, okay, people are expecting this thing to happen. They're thinking about it in terms of these things called words, or with hypnosis, a lot of times people are using words to create some kind of imagery in your head. How would you do hypnosis on somebody that's blind, or someone that couldn't hear, or someone that was blind and deaf, right? What other sensory modality can you utilize for this effect? And the idea is that this is sensory agnostic. What this is doing has nothing to do with just the visual representation of the word, or the sounds, or the smells, or the touch, or whatever. It's getting at something deeper. And I think this is why, which you'll see later on, is there's some people who are, for hypnodermatology, for getting rid of warts or whatever it is that they can build up a picture in their head, like a visual picture in their head. It doesn't even have to be that detailed, and they'll still have the same effect. And there's other people who have to, build a really detailed image for them in their head to have any kind of effect. And it may not even be the same as the person with a less vivid idea. So it's not just this idea of vividness. You can get much more from less complex and sophisticated of an image. Okay, here's another one that I haven't seen people typically throw in with these things. The rubber hand illusion and the phantom limb syndrome. All right, so let's look at this real quick, right? So most people are convinced that their body parts are in fact their own, but in some clinical conditions, this sense of ownership can be lost. So perceptual illusions, most famously the rubber hand illusion, demonstrate that a sense of ownership over a body part or an entire body that is not in fact ours can easily be induced in healthy volunteers. Now, I want you to think about this for a moment. What are we doing when we speak to each other and we say, "Oh, hey, Jess, Michael, Mukund, you, he, she, whatever," these sort of pointers that we have in this sort of space of words, is one of the ways that we do that is we learn to associate our sense of self with other things, right? So when you look at this sort of phantom limb, that's not actually yours, but you're convinced that it's yours. It's the same thing as an actor getting into role. It's the exact same kind of perceptual phenomena. It's the same thing as people that are reading, they're going under some hypnotic prompt about, feeling that they're on a beach doing whatever somewhere. That's technically not real. You're just engaging with this kind of representation, right? And it turns out, if you look at these sort of fake limbs and you're truly convinced that that is yours, right, through different, perceptual illusion things you can do, you will feel pain. If someone's hitting you with a hammer or cutting it or whatever, you'll feel that even though that's not actually yours, right? Which is very fascinating, right? So, this particular study, because it can increase histamine. So once again, perception, thought, words, language, whatever these labels we give those things, can literally increase and modify physical constituents in the body, physical things, just through this internal cognitive process alone, right? Interesting. So on a similar note, we have psychologically induced cooling of a specific body part caused by the illusory ownership of an artificial counterpart. So basically, this is a very similar thing, and this time people were also able to modify temperature, right, just through thought alone, right? So I think that's very interesting, right? And now you have to think about all the metabolic things that temperature is tied to, and what other things you can modify about that, for longevity, health purposes. For me, if I'm in New York or Boston or Toronto in the winter and it's freezing cold, it's nice to be able to think about warming up my body and I can warm it up. That would be pretty convenient, and to have true kind of master control to be able to toggle between that. I think that's pretty interesting. Here's another sort of a dot to connect here is mirror touch synesthesia. So I'm curious if any of you have heard of this one before. Mirror touch synesthesia. There might be a delay again.
So I haven't. Oh,
There we go. Now I can hear you.
I haven't heard of it, but I think I've experienced or seen parts of it even in my own experiences with other people. Like I don't know how is it, what is it related to? Like I've said, like, oh, I don't know it well enough to say, but here I'm going to say something and tell me how it overlaps or not.
Sure, go for
One
it.
of the classic things, like a long time ago, when I was deciding what to do with my like career
Yeah.
or whatever, it was I knew someone who was they went they went to become a surgeon because
Yeah.
that's what they wanted to do, but also because they didn't want to deal with other things and they were fine with working in that environment. And I was like, oh,
Right.
like I think I would be very good in a hospital sense of I can perform a procedure on somebody else and
Right.
it doesn't negatively impact me at all. I'm not really grossed out by blood or whatever.
Right.
But when I'm like watching a video, particularly when I'm watching someone experience unpleasantness or a physical thing, I would call that something like really, really high sensory empathy. So
Yeah,
like
it
if
is.
something's
That's
happening to
that's a
them,
fair assessment. Yeah.
and I'm curious how it relates to like if you're seeing someone experience, like how do you feel or how does yourself differentiate from that or not? Yeah.
Right. Well, this is tying into the thing I was saying earlier about, how we differentiate our sense of self from the things that are not ourselves. And what mirror
Right.
touch synesthesia is basically just how an actor, I say really good actors, they don't read their script, they feel their script. Whatever
Mm.
character could be entirely made up and fictional, by the way, right? Existing on just the black ink on a white piece of paper, right? They can literally feel things that their character is supposed to feel. They can feel the back pain, the shoulder pain, a neck ache, a headache, all these kinds of things, right? That sounds like textbook placebo and hypnosis, right? Interesting. But mirror touch synesthesia is already sort of this naturally occurring thing that we've never quite connected the dots on before, as far as I can tell. But I can look at, if I have this, I can look at Jess, and if someone punches you in the shoulder,
Ouch.
in your arm, right? Well, I'm gonna feel something just by looking at it. I also think that people have this to a degree when they do respond to gory images and they see things happen, right? I think this is already a thing that's there, and it's a form of empathy. But what we mean by empathy is a kind of coordination. And as I've said before,
Mhm.
is that language is essentially coordination. If you make it a very abstract definition, it's just how systems are able to connect and disconnect, and both are forms of coordination, right? That's a very big theme here. And what's kind of interesting, right, with mirror touch synesthesia, is if you broaden the definition of that, the fact that you are relating to something else in such a way that you could experience it. Well, now this opens up the door to all the stuff in hypnosis and placebo about people could just give you a set of phrases or imagery and get these effects, right? It's very interesting. Um, and I have other ideas as to what this kind of mimicry is also suggestive of, which we can get into later. But let's kind of quickly move on because I'm on a time constraint today. Okay, here's another one. So I've written about this, I've talked about this, yapped my mouth off about it for the last 2 years. But the idea that language and synesthesia are essentially the same thing, because they're just sensory associations with each other, right? So right now, the noises I'm making don't technically intrinsically have meaning, but I'm associating them with these other squiggles, arbitrary squiggles on the screen called words. Right. So when I say a taste for words and sounds, those sounds and shapes aren't technically intrinsically tied to each other. They're just ways for us to relate to it and utilize it, right? And it's the same thing why you can make an olfactory language, where you can create, an olfactory language that associates smell with different shapes and ideas and feelings and all these kinds of things, right? But in this case of this kind of sound gustatory synesthesia, is that in some of these cases, humans, just like you, just like me, they can hear something, they can see something, it could be a word, a sound, imagery, whatever, and they can literally taste it, right? They can literally taste it. Or even, in some cases, people can smell things. Now, what's very interesting is that if I'm talking about, a juicy filet mignon from Capitol Grill or a steakhouse, that may not even be what triggers it. It could be a seemingly unrelated word that triggers it, like the word, I don't know, modality or something, or implicated gives you that taste of steak or something, or smell of it or whatever, right? It's not even intrinsically tied to the word that's representing it, which is interesting because you can already see there's that level of fluidity and flexibility. Okay, this one is pretty crazy. I believe it's pronounced pseudocyesis. Have any of you heard of this one before?
No.
Okay, so we're going to take a quick cursory reading of this, right? So this is a psychopathological clinical syndrome in which a non-pregnant woman firmly believes that she is pregnant and manifests many of the symptoms and signs of pregnancy, right? Just let's take that slowly again. You can have a non-pregnant woman who firmly believes that she is pregnant, and many of those symptoms and measures and signs of pregnancy will manifest, right? So that's pretty crazy, right? So now let's look a little more into this kind of summary, right? So you can get these physiological manifestations of pregnancy, including irregular menstruation. This is a very, very directly physical, measurable thing. Once again, through this thing called cognition, mind, whatever it is, you're able to induce physical, measurable changes, right? Interesting. Abdominal distension, the subjective feeling of fetal movements, and my personal favorite, if we really want to appeal to the Kardashians in Hollywood, changes in breast size and shape, right? That's pretty insane, right? Milk secretion, darkening of the areolar, weight gain, all these other things, okay? And it's just very fascinating that you can just do this through this thing that we call psychology. But I think it's the sort of interesting thing here, right, is that we have this kind of line in the sand we've drawn between psychology and biology. And I think deep down, they are essentially one and the same. I don't think this is not my idea. This is plenty of other people who think this. I know Michael Levin thinks very similarly. But just think about this for a moment. Just through believing, through thought, through language, through words, through whatever these whatever labels we want to give it, you can literally induce these symptoms, the physical symptoms and instantiations of a pregnancy, right? Especially the changes in breast size and shape. That's pretty interesting, right? Very strange.
Has there been any I don't know if you're aware of any like follow-up research. I'd be curious to see if there does exist, like, I agree with you, this whole like division of psychology and
Yeah.
biology, but I'd be curious to see if there are like hard lines, as like from a
Yeah.
pseudo perspective, like we can never trigger, this biological process that does occur in real
Yes.
pregnancy.
So I think there are hard lines. Are they impossible to move? I don't know. So if you look at a lot of these kinds of these experiments, hypnosis, placebo, whatever, there's times where it won't work or things won't happen, and people will just sort of be like, okay, well, we don't know why, we just know it didn't work in some people. And if that is tied to this kind of phenomenon of of hypnotic suggestibility and all that, there's a good chance we could probably train people to work over that and then move the line. All right. So what we'll get into a little bit later on this sort of topic is what are the ceiling effects?
Oh
Because
yeah,
there's
sorry, but just
Yeah.
a quick. My point wasn't to like push past the hard line, but more
Right.
that I think the presence of the boundary tells you
Okay.
something interesting about
Yeah.
Right.
biological constraints. Whereas like with something like
Yes.
placeboing
Yeah.
Tylenol or like placeboing caffeine, the
Right.
like neuronal dynamics are too complicated to decipher. Whereas
Right.
like pregnancy symptoms are a lot easier to at least separate and like
Yes.
build like a classifier.
Yes. This is worth a whole nother salon actually, and we can talk about this when I work through the slides super quickly. So just keep that in mind, Mukund, because I want to talk more about that. Let me go to the next one super quick. Okay. I'm just on a slight time constraint today, so I'm rushing a little bit. All right. This is another interesting one. self-hypnosis, biofeedback, and voluntary peripheral temperature control in children. So this is pretty interesting. All three groups showed significant success with warming and cooling, right? Now you have to think about this for a moment. Wait a minute. Just through thought, through mind, through perception, through words, language, whatever, I can change the physical temperature of a part of my body to be warmer or colder. Think of all the metabolic implications and health implications about temperature and all those kinds of things, right? So very interesting that you can just do that through thought alone, through this thing called hypnosis, which is essentially painting a kind of picture of yourself through words or imagery, right? And I would be very interested to do studies. In fact, this is something I actually want to design and do on these sort of hypnosis, placebo, conditioning protocols using different sensory modalities, right? So, the typical hypnosis when people are using words, like if you're deaf, and you're blind, for instance, well, good luck. How are you going to do it? How are you going to represent those things in terms of, say, Braille or some olfactory language or whatever? Like, how is that going to work? And that's why I'm saying whatever this is doing is agnostic to the language it's being expressed in a sense. I think each one has its own benefit, right, depending on the person. This is that whole perceptual cryptography idea. But I think whatever this is getting at is beyond just this current interface that we call language and all of that. So another interesting example. All right, this is another interesting one. There's this guy, David Spiegel at Stanford, who's one of the remaining researchers who's still kind of talking about hypnosis. He's been on a bunch of podcasts and things. You may have seen him around it at some point. He's at Stanford. I'd like to do a Salon with him at some point, actually, on this kind of stuff. But the ability of hypnosis to both stimulate and inhibit gastric acid secretion in highly hypnotizable healthy volunteers was examined in 2 studies. So, the gist of this one is that hypnosis, which is just, these verbal prompts. And it's not even like some crazy fancy thing. It's just literally describing the process. Like, you're going to feel X, Y, and Z at this moment and so on. You can literally modify gastric acid secretion in your body. This is a physical compound that your body is creating, right? And it's generating this just through something internal happening in your mind that, for all intents and purposes, is imaginary. Language is a very useful illusion, right? In a weird way. Here's another one, and this wasn't specifically a study. This is more of an interesting anecdote that somebody in the Ekkolápto community had shown me a while back. There's this dude named Solomon Shereshevsky, and apparently had this unusually intense multisensory synesthesia. Basically every sensory modality could invoke very interesting experiences. But he was reportedly able to use imagery to change his physiology. So from a resting pulse, he could raise it to something higher by imagining himself in a very stressful situation or running for a train. Or to lower his pulse and all that, he would imagine himself in a very relaxing, calm situation. Interesting dots to connect with this, because this is very similar to how actors will train to get themselves stressed up, to sweat, all these kinds of things, and to do the opposite, to calm down and feel relaxed. And you can literally train this yourself. This is just basic biofeedback, where you can hook yourself up to a monitor and you can just focus on coordinating with it to lower your heart rate, increase it, whatever. You can gain very fine-tuned control of it, and there's plenty of people that have done this before. Another interesting dot to connect. He could raise the temperature of one hand while lowering the other by imagining one touching a hot stove and the other gripping ice. All right, so once again, the sort of top-down control of temperature, which has all sorts of implications for metabolism and all that, right? And then for pain, this is another interesting one that connects to mirror touch synesthesia and all these other things, is that apparently, if he was in pain, he would just separate it from his sense of self. I'd be like, it's hurting something else, not me, right? And now you can think of the reverse of that, about how people will try to feel pain about something with the phantom limb syndrome and all that, right? Is they're associating that limb as being themselves. And I imagine you could do the opposite and think of, if you have your real limb that's getting hurt and you're convinced that the fake limb is yours that's not getting hurt, you won't feel it, right? Another interesting experiment to run. But this, like I write at the bottom, it sounds like mirror touch synesthesia and phantom limb syndrome. So now that we've gotten past some of this stuff, I want to bring you all to some other weirder examples. How many of you have seen Breaking Bad? We can't do a show of hands, but we can get a yes or no from the audience, because I'm about to spoil the scene. All right, the show came out in 2008. I'm expecting everybody has seen it by now, but in case you haven't, spoiler alert. It's not a big spoiler, but So there's a scene where Mr. White and Mr. Pinkman are locked in this the meth lab RV in this junkyard, trailer park, whatever. Okay, and Hank, Mr. Schrader's closing in on them. He's got a scent of something suspicious and sus happening. Sorry, I was thinking about the Hank Sussy Baka meme right now. But anyway, so he's there, he's locking in on them. And Walt has this genius idea about, here, let me call up Saul. Let's fake a phone call to Hank that his wife Marie was in this sort of catastrophic accident. Now, mind you, he doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't know that this is being orchestrated behind the scenes. So he gets a call, a very convincing call from someone that sounds like they're at a hospital, talking about his wife Marie, that she's been in this bad accident and he needs to go over ASAP. You can't just say that plainly. You have to sort of thematically present it and frame it. Right, this is staging. This is how you sell the illusion. It's marketing in a sense. It's the same thing. And just through words alone, she is able to physically reorient what Hank is doing. The entire complex cascade of chemistry and physics inside of his body, move his whole body around to go to the other part of town, to go to the hospital and whatever. Just through making these sounds, these sounds, these things that we call words, right? Another example of this would be let's just say. We had Dugan, the human, and we had Dugan, who was made out of stone, same size and shape and weight and everything. But we had Dugan the human, Dugan the size, Dugan is stone. Now, if you wanted to move the stone Dugan, the real human Dugan would have to physically reorient himself, use time and calories and energy to go and push and move that thing around, right? Even though it's the same size and shape and weight as him. Now, if that thing was, agential and a kind of mind, for instance, well, all you really have to do is say a couple of words, make a couple noises with your mouth, and you can get that entire complex cascade of chemistry and physics, all these cells, all your bones, your muscles, your heart, your liver, your eyes, everything. You could reorient all of that in space in a flash just by saying a couple of words. And now you can just tell it to move and it'll move. And you've now just moved hundreds of pounds of something by just making a noise. That's it. You never had to physically move yourself to do it, right? Interesting perspective. Why it's moving is not the words, though. Well, it's not just the words, and we can get into that. Before I move on to the other example, some of you may have seen this older presentation I did at Microsoft Nerd with Dan Elton, like 2024 or something. I gave the example of a comedy roast, and I thought how interesting it is that just through visually shaping this sort of scene, just by putting up these arbitrary symbols and signs and stones and chairs into a room, it all of a sudden becomes completely acceptable to say the most heinous things about somebody. Like, I made the joke that if you said, on the roast of Tom Brady, for instance, if you said the things you said about him at the roast at his house, he would deflate your balls, right? It's just very interesting how these things shape this thing that we call context. So I think that's interesting. And then, why is it that looking at certain images, just patterns of lights and colors, can make you start laughing? Like, what the heck even is laughing? Just by looking at this or hearing this, you can make this very weird physical change in your face. Another interesting example. Yeah, Jess, you remember that event? Yeah, that was so long ago. It feels like forever ago. The other example I can give is what if I could show you a pattern of lights and colors that can make you generate liquid from your face? Well, that's just called a sad image. That's exactly how actors will learn to crowd and demand, which is, usually not a normal skill people are born with, right? So just by looking at this thing, this image, right, this pattern of lights and colors, that's it. You can literally generate a physical substrate from your body just by looking at that, right? Really interesting. Similar thing I made at the last salon when I was with Andres in SF is, we were looking at the food table of fruits and vegetables and all that, and just by looking at that, we're able to generate liquid in our mouth called saliva just by looking at it. And one of the reasons that mukbang and all those things are super popular on YouTube and everything, and people like cooking videos, is they will literally salivate by looking at essentially a fake image of food. The food is represented through pixels and colors and lights on your screen. It's not actually there. I mean, yet it's a useful illusion to engage with it, and your mind will react to it as if it's kind of there, and you'll salivate. Right? Same reason that people who watch parkour videos or mountain climbing videos, people at very high heights, they can start feeling sweaty in their palms just by looking at those images. those patterns of lights and colors, you can literally generate liquid from your hands. Pretty interesting, right? And I think one nice thing to kind of tie this together, there is a researcher who I have a deep amount of respect for and admiration, very much a role model in every stretch of the word, Michael Levin, who, again, I'm sure everybody knows, but he basically says that everything is placebo. And I'm going to press this video and see if actually, it's not going to work. So I guess we can't play the video. But he goes on this short clip on this thing called Adventures in Awareness, this podcast, to talk about how everything is essentially placebo, right? Just by thinking about it, I can move my mouth to do these things. I'm creating physical changes in my body. If I think about getting up and going to the next room, I can physically reorient the hundreds of pounds that are there in my body, all the complexity that's there inside, everything, and move it and reorient it, right? Just through thinking about it alone, right? The idea of how thought relates to action and behavior is very, very intrinsic. Let's see. Okay, now here's the fun part. This is all very cool, and I think that everything that we just spoke about is one and the same. Hypnosis, psychosomatic conditions, placebo, nocebo, acting, all these things. I think these are all essentially one and the same thing. These are not different. These are fundamentally the same mechanism of how the observer, how observing changes the observer, how measuring changes the measurer, and how the act of perceiving changes the perceiver. And again, this is all very cool, but now what the hell can we actually do with it, right? That's the real key here. So one of the experiments that I'm currently designing right now is, can we train the human body to memorize and remember the preferred effects of something like caffeine, so you don't have to keep buying it, right? Now, just for some context here, this is the first experiment, and there are many, many, many other experiments I want to do afterwards that relate to memorizing and storing and conditioning the effects of minoxidil and finasteride for hair loss, metformin, maybe even rapamycin, different kinds of painkillers, right? And some of these things have already been explored in the literature with like caffeine and painkillers to a degree, but not in the exact way that I want to do it, because I think if you formalize this and you systematize it a bit, it becomes easier to share and use with other people. So we're gonna have
quick question. Is this
Yes.
plausible for like things like peptides too, or does the like underlying biological functionality kind of break down there?
I would say that it is possible. I mean, here's so sort of on the ceiling effects and the boundaries of these things, right? So what I think is that I think there's multiple mechanisms by which this would work, right? Because the thing about caffeine is you're not actually trying to get your body to make caffeine. You're just trying to get it to recreate the effects that you like from caffeine. The buzz that you get in the morning when you first drink your cup of coffee, right? When you're feeling kind of sloppy and tired, and you drink this kind of interesting drink, and then all of a sudden you have all this energy to focus and all that, right? Kind of interesting. Oh, did I lose you?
Oh, could I say something?
Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
I think I'm somewhat sensitive to the levels of I think neuropeptide Y, because I know that if I eat protein, it reduces that the levels of that, and I'm able to actually sense the sensation of that occurring. So I just want to put that out there.
That's interesting. I think everybody has some level of receptivity and sensitivity to these things that we don't even necessarily explore, and they kind of spontaneously happen in their lives, but because we don't have a system to interpret it, we just kind of write it off as some experience that happened. But to the point of what Moken was saying is that I do think in the case of things like peptides, either you can get your body to actually produce these things because it already knows how to produce it, but another doable thing is just the effects that you want out of it. Okay, if your measurable effects are, you want energy or better healing capabilities, taking those peptides is not necessarily the only way to skin the cat and get that done, right? So there's multiple ways that this might be working underneath, behind the curtains, that don't involve literally the actual compound itself, even though your body produces these kinds of peptides and stuff like that. But for example, I don't think you don't have to get your body necessarily to produce BBC 157 to get the effects that you want from it. Same with caffeine. You don't have to get your body to actually manufacture and produce caffeine to get the effect. You just want to get these changes in working memory, attention, reaction time, blood pressure, all that kinds of stuff, right? And so my views on this, I can give you sort of my more reserved feelings, and then what I think might actually be true. My reserved feelings for the moment is that I think caffeine, painkillers, anything that falls more traditionally on psychology and cognition is going to be way easier. So I think this is the same for psychedelics and psychoactive substances. Like I think those are going to be much more easier to do, and there is already some anecdotes and evidence about stuff like this. That stuff I'm not really worried about. The ones that I'm more interested in are the crazier ones like metformin, minoxidil, finasteride, and then even a layer above that would be exercise. So I'm curious. You've probably heard me ramble my mouth off about hormesis time and time again. I'm going to do it again. Take your shot when I say it, Jess. But the idea with hormesis, right, is what if I told you that every day, if you added teeny tiny little cracks to your muscles, teeny tiny little tears to your muscles, that you're actually making it healthier and robust in the long run. It sounds kind of stupid, but if you really think about it, that's exactly what's happening, right? You're actually inducing stress, a loss of structure and information acutely, temporarily, and then the system is able to respond back and become stronger, become more, anti-fragile, as they say. What's kind of interesting about this is, when you're lifting weights, right? When you're in the gym and you're lifting that 100 pounds, or you're running on the treadmill and you're putting all that weight on your bones, you're not after the teeny cracks in your bones. You're not after the tears in your muscles. You're after the effect that's prompting in the body. It's sending all these anti-inflammatory responses, all these growth factors, IGF-1, growth hormone, all these things, and that's what makes your body stronger. But here's the key aspect: is those prompts are instructions. Even if your body already knows how to produce all these things and it can produce as much of it as it wants, it needs a signal, a pointer, a prompt, an instruction to say, hey, make this much of X and send it here, not over there. That's really what exercise is doing. And the same exact principle carries over to this other thing called microneedling. Now, I'm curious if any of you've heard about microneedling before.
Microneedling or
Microneedling, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Oh, yeah.
just Sajith, I think so. It seems you know what it is. You want to give people a quick pointer on it, what microneedling is.
Basically, you just I think it's mainly used for hair loss, right? To promote and rejuvenate the scalp. So you basically poke a bunch of like needles across your scalp, and that induces blood flow into the area, and that promotes and like revitalizes the cells there, I guess.
Yeah. So it's used for skin and hair. Now, it's not just hair loss; it's also for skin. So what this essentially is this kind of pen, and you got a bunch of teeny tiny little needles all over it, and that thing is stabbing you, a million times a second. On it could be on your face, on your neck, on your scalp, wherever else, maybe somewhere else on your arm or your hands, and you will bleed from this. And it's so painful that you usually have to use some kind of numbing agent, and stuff like that, like a numbing cream. Um, and the reason that you're doing this, which is a very sort of relatively well studied thing in dermatology and hair science and everything about microneedling, is you're literally inducing damage. You're damaging your skin. You're creating all these teeny tiny holes and tears in your skin. That's very similar to creating those tears in your muscles or the little cracks in your bones when you exercise. This is exercise for your skin and your hair follicles. What you're after is not the damage. What you're after is the instructions the damage is pointing to, and the body's response to that, to send all these anti-inflammatory signals, all these growth factors, yada yada, so that the skin grows back more healthy, right? And this is another interesting perspective on this: is why is it that if let's just say you damage your skin, you cut it really bad, and you get a scar? Why is it that cutting it again actually makes the scar better, right? You damage your skin, and then if you damage it again in a certain way, it removes the scar, right? That's the process of scar treatments. Is people will undergo microneedling. They'll go, at different depths, right? Because the needles can have depths. You can have laser resurfacing that can also go at different depths, and there's different kinds of lasers, right? Very interesting that just by damaging an area again, you can actually make it healthier and restore it. It's almost like it's overwriting a memory in a sense. This could have interesting tie-ins to Levin and Alon and all that kinds of stuff, right? But what you're getting at with this and what you'd want to condition is the instructions of how much and what to produce and where to send it. And I don't think you need to have those physical tie-ins anymore if you train on this. I think theoretically, this would be a very fun experiment that I want to do 100% at some point, because I think it is possible, is take exercise, take microneedling, which might be a little bit easier to start off with. And each time that people are undergoing these treatments, you train them, to associate some kind of sensory or linguistic kind of association or whatever. I say that these prompts are like biological passcodes. They associate this each time that they undergo the treatment as their body's responding to this, and then eventually they can just sort of think about it, and their body will send these growth factor responses, which their body technically only does when it's healthier and younger, without having to use the physical stimulus, right? And what this is the core idea of all of this is we're moving away from the physical to the informational. The mind as its own pharmacy, right? That's a big idea of what we're getting at with this. And the other kind of crazy experiment, that I want to actually talk about, that I want to do at some point, is think of the phantom limb syndrome and all that kinds of stuff, right? And how that's relating to your sort of model of the self. And if you perturb and you modify that model of the self, does the self actually change? And we could say that that does happen to some degree, very clearly with the phantom limb stuff or mirror touch synesthesia, right? So here's another interesting thing. If you're going to ride this line of thought, is I'm willing to bet the reason why visualization can work for athletes to make them stronger, gain strength, why phantom limb syndrome can even work at all, why placebo and hypnosis work, is you're painting a picture of what your sense of self is supposed to be versus what it is currently. And you're associating and you're coordinating and you're latching on to that, right? What I imagine you could probably do for skin conditions, for sure, and this is more testable, is it would be very interesting if you had somebody look at, sort of a mock-up or, a real digital visualization of themselves every day. And it reacted like them so they had enough things to convince their body. It could be a fake mirror, for instance, right? You could set up a fake mirror that people just look at every day that shows, if they have acne or rosacea and it's going away. As I'm willing to bet if they looked at that every day and they believed that that was actually themselves, the thing would go away. The effect would go away. And I think that's a more easy one to sort of, connect the dots on. The question is, what are the more extreme things you can do? Can you do this for hair growth? Can you do this for bone growth, even for all sorts of different kinds of, physiological conditions? And I think it's possible. Are you going to go from a recessed chin to a giga chad? I don't know. Are you going to go from 5 feet to 6 feet 7? I don't know. I think there'd probably be some changes at the very least, but I'm willing to bet if we knew how to correctly hack this and figure out exactly what's going on, we could probably reap a lot more benefits than just these things that I'm bringing up right now. And so I think that's basically it for the main keynote, because I'll have to go soon. But I'm very interested to have now a kind of open salon discussion, rambling thoughts, criticisms, experimental ideas, especially because I've raised funding for that. So I'm all ears and eyes.
Yeah, I have a lot of different comments
Go
that I
for it.
try to take some chats in the chat. So I'll try to start from where I am and go backwards.
Go for
I
it.
think I think I think to speak kind of to the core point first and then radiate out a bit from that. I think what you're getting at is really interesting. I think the optimism that you're expressing about looking at where is the boundary
Mhm.
is a good space to look at. And I think it's going to positively push against a lot of sort of the
Right.
pseudoscience and things that aren't established yet.
Right.
I think it will be really interesting. I think the last thing I put in the chat was what can be recruited. Like going
Right.
back to the pregnancy example, like it
Yeah.
is, I don't mean this in a, I don't mean this too strongly or like negatively
Sure.
or whatever. I think it should be zero surprise to anybody that someone's hormones can be influenced by their thoughts. Like
Right.
that's like
And
absolutely
yet it's very surprising to some people.
it
One,
is.
one
And
thing
that's
I'll like to say really quickly, when I've talked to various different kinds of people about this and gotten different opinions, is, it's so interesting where I say that the ingredients are on the table, but the chef isn't there.
yeah.
The ingredients are all there, but the chef is not. Yeah.
Well, and and that's because we don't talk about it as well. A lot of
Right.
your work, what yeah, you know, and we all know here, but a lot of the implicit work that Addy's doing is sort of advocating for people to sort of realize that that's the case, and I salute you for that. And I think the recruitment part and I think the pregnancy part is it's a little bit too simple of an example, but for the
Right.
point I'm making, like recruiting as in there are certain things that are definitely going to be a lot easier to induce, particularly at the amount of regulation
Right.
that's available and the type of responses that are let's say, you could say this isn't quite the right way to use these terms.
Yeah.
Like the sampling rate of the regulatory response is high relative to immediately present external stimuli
Yeah.
versus the kind of resources that would recruit to prepare, like do things to the eggs or simulate,
Yeah.
oh, a sperm, like that requires a
Yeah.
very different recruitment of the operations and a very different regulatory or like an allostatic shift in a very
Yep.
particular direction of different systems.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't say that. I think a cool like a macro thing that you're looking at is like, okay, like how do you, and the research you're doing across these different domains, how do you get to look at where is that essentially what you mean by the ceiling of things, or how do you
Yeah, I mean,
talk about
it's
that?
sort of like, could we reach a point, assuming we can train these things more, which is another rabbit hole, right? About how can we train these things and make,
Right.
gain more sort of plastic control over things. Because I do think in the future, um, hey, maybe you wanted to grow curly hair instead of straight hair, or you wanted um, modify some aspect of your brain to have savant syndrome, or you could sort of have master control over your biology. And it's not that you could do literally everything ever, right? It's just that you can do
Mm.
more than you could before. Um, and I think the other thing I wanted to bring up was that I think what will end up happening is I don't know if there's necessarily a universal way to do this in everyone. The concept is the same, but the instantiation might be different. And the extreme cases are
Yes.
literally, how do you do this in people that are deaf and blind, right?
Yeah.
So, for instance, if somebody wants to change their skin and they're deaf and blind, you have to sort of line up with their conceptual model of their skin and their face,
Yes. Yeah.
right? And you can't just you can't show them an image because they're blind, right? And I think this is also important because this ties into what we consider to be language and all these kinds of things. I mean, in my head, um, everything is a kind of prompt. And if we model the world that way and we think about it that way, it lets us do a lot more.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyways, keep going.
And that was one of the other points. If
Yeah.
anybody else wants to say stuff or raise their hand, go in. I have a lot of things about this. It's cool.
Yeah.
That
I mean,
dovetails
I
into
have I have some comments,
yeah. Go
Go
ahead,
for
Derek.
it.
questions. Okay, so basically, how much of the body is regulated by, the spinal stem? Like,
Right.
how much is regulated by that,
Right.
by the extension of your brain, essentially.
Mhm.
Like imagine your brain as not just stopping at the medulla oblongata, but also
Right.
going down into your
Mm,
spine and
Right.
dendrites. So,
Right.
how much control is there, and then how much control can you
Can you
access
expand it?
consciously?
Right. So something interesting, right, is if we're gonna go by that kind of train of thought, is like, yeah, like, okay, I can have conscious control over when I blink. Some people can like consciously induce goosebumps, and some people can move their ears because they've kind of born with it, or they can train for it. Um, there's sort of these existing structures of allowing our nervous system to interact with all these different things. But what I actually think is you can use the nervous system to expand itself. That's a whole nother thing with the
mm,
hypnosis biofeedback stuff, is that okay, yeah, I can't necessarily just actively control when I want my hair to grow, but I could probably train and find a way to do it and expand my nervous system, because every tool that we have is essentially a way of expanding our sense of self. I know when I used to do martial arts, people used to always say the bow staff, the weapon or whatever is an extension of the self
right.
in a weird way. And
Hmm.
that's what teams are. That's the whole social computing idea as well, which is, again, story for another time. But my quick answer to this is that, yeah, I think there's some basic ceiling effects that, like, okay, yeah, I'm not going to be able to just like imagine um, you know, growing one follicle of hair in this particular area of my leg or something, just like that. You have to build a machinery to do it. And I also think part of what's happening with this is I think some people are more, receptive to these kinds of things than other people have to be trained more. Now, one key aspect of all these hypnosis experiments, right, is that they're also trying to filter for people that are more hypnotically suggestible, right? So
Yes.
even on the caffeine experiment, what I suspect is going to happen is there's going to be a small group that will have, maybe zero to small effects, right? It's not doesn't do all that much. There's going to be a larger group that will have, decent measurable effects, but nothing too staggering. And then there will be a small group again at the end that will have very strong effects, have gotten it very quickly, and I'm quite certain that's going to correlate with hypnotic suggestibility. So this is a whole thing is that I think you can use the nervous system to expand itself, just like you can use the your muscles to build more muscle. You can use your nervous system to grow and expand more of itself. That's my high level answer to this. Is I think there's current ceilings that we can't do, but we can eventually train and find a way to do it through this kind of thing. Maybe it help from some other mechanisms potentially like biofeedback. But that's my short answer. I don't know if that's helpful at all.
I think I'm really curious, and I would love
Yeah.
to work on this specifically at some point. This is more of a down the road thing, but it has to do
Yeah.
a little with the actors bit and what I meant
Mhm.
with I put in individuals and meeting centers, and even what
Yeah.
you just said about the susceptibility. Like for example, one of my friends is like Northern European,
Yep.
Scottish ancestry, red hair, incredibly sensitive, more than the average population, to very minute changes in temperature and other things that like
And
their sensitivity or their sampling rate or whatever you want to call it to certain things is just you can say that's a phenotypical difference or deeper genetic or whatever. I don't really know how to specify
right.
that. But it's sort of like what if you're if you're training or you want a desired outcome
Right.
where someone's more receptive to a certain thing, how much, like what are sort of like the tectonic plates that you have to do that? Like, and then can you shift them? Or what are the smaller, how
Right.
targeted can you be relative to the systems that are
Yeah.
producing the thing, right?
And
I
these are
think
great
that's
for
huge.
experiments. Yeah.
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 And like what I'm very curious about and would like to like a very Joe Pro cognition futures thing that we've been looking at and that I would like to do in the long term is like
Mhm.
as there's sort of an intermediary intrapersonal there's language and structures and models to be made about the internal stuff that
Right.
it's easy to if I say, oh, I know someone of Scottish ancestry
Right.
who is, but you know exactly what that means. There are
Right.
similarly
Exactly.
internal structures, right, that are as nuanced as that. You can say personality types, you can say
Yep.
information processing types, or even like handedness preferences for those things,
Yeah.
and those will all affect the things that we're talking about. In part because to go back to the actor's comment, and I'll kind of step off after this
Yeah.
the actor's comment matters. And even the thing about the when I said before about the words, like, oh, it's not the
Yeah.
word, it's
Yeah.
because of how for the person, what motivationally speaking, like the guy in the car or whatever, you're
Yep.
attaching the word to something that has immense internal meaning
Right.
that
Right.
has been accumulated outside of the moment. That's an existing asset
Yep.
that can be wielded or pulled or tugged in a direction. So how does that change for the individuals? How does that change for all these other things we're talking about?
Yeah.
I think there's certain care, and this is why I always mention the thing from Levin about ethical implications about that blah 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 for things that are happening in the future. Is like we need to be able to care about what those things
Yeah.
are too,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
there's the trade-off between understanding and the ability to manipulate them, but also like there are things of value there that are existing and happening that are not
Yeah.
given their due. So a lot of things, but
Yeah.
cool talk. Yeah.
Yeah. So definitely curious to hear any other comments or thoughts because I do want to talk a little bit more about the experimental design because this is going to be key
Yeah.
to lock in.
So the part that I'm like a bit confused about or worried
Yes.
about is like the amount of variance that there will be. So
Hmm.
well, given the example of caffeine, like I've done experiments on myself, like where, I try different dosages, I try like different timings and whatever. And it's very subjective because
Yep.
there's a lot of factors, including like, how well you slept that day, what you have going
Hmm.
on. Um, that it's really hard to disentangle the effect of like caffeine from all these other things. And I
Yep.
suspect that you're going to run into the same issue for this as well. And given that, fundamentally the one of the variables here is a placebo, right?
Yep.
I'm wondering like how you think about disentangling those factors.
Right. So this is a great question, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to do this is so that we can kind of I can get different thoughts on this. So the way I wanted to do this, right? So there's a couple initial ideas of the experiment that I wanted to do, where people would have to go into a very controlled room. They're going to ritualize each thing that they do. So they're going to step in with their right foot only. They're going to pick up the mug with only their right hand. They're going to say a mantra, then they'll drink the coffee. And what you're trying to do is give the mind as many things to grab onto that are only uniquely for this situation. So it's things that won't be repeated anywhere else, right? It's this idea of pray rest placebo and all that kind of stuff. But for the experiment that I've kind of honed in on now is that the end goal is to be able to see if people can just say this prompt and get the feeling of caffeine. Now, on one hand, we're going after certain effects of caffeine, like, the increases in what we, energy is measured through reaction time and all those kinds of things. But, also caffeine can make people sleepy, right? If they drink coffee, some people can actually feel sleepier and tired. And different kinds of coffee can affect people in different ways. And so this has been a very, very, it's a surprisingly complicated thing when you consider all the nuances. And my way of doing this is if we're going to have to engage with the noise and the uncertainty, let's at least keep track of it. All right, so we want to standardize all the coffee that people are taking. And if some people feel sleepy for it, fine. Maybe that's an interesting thing about, some people like to drink coffee before they go to sleep because it makes it easier, is maybe for them, they use that to, it's a sleeping aid. Like I've had this thing where I tried to condition myself on Benadryl, so I don't have to take the Benadryl, but I could feel the phenomenology of being sleepy, and it's much easier to fall asleep. I've done a similar thing with caffeine and painkillers that I've written about in the past. And I think a more agnostic way to look at this study is just, in the end, can people say a prompt, this specifically designed prompt, and think about it, and they can get measurable physical effects. That's the first step. Now, whether they're going to get the energetic aspects of caffeine or it'll make them sleepy or something else, I'm not fully sure on that, because that one is going to be much harder to filter out unless we specifically only filter people who feel energetic off of coffee, which is one thing that we could do, right? So I don't know. I slightly forgot your question. I may have gotten off track a little bit there.
I think that's an interesting approach. I'm not convinced that it's actually going to disentangle the factors because it is so complex.
What could we do that would disentangle it, or at least disentangle it more?
Another thing to set a straight thought was that when you talk about replicating the effects of caffeine,
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering across like what time horizon, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
do you want someone to feel the effect of caffeine for a minute, 5 minutes,
Yes.
whatever? Because if you talk to, like,
Yes.
for example, like pretty advanced like meditators, like you can
Mm-hmm.
induce all kinds of feelings in
Yes.
the body, right? So if you can
Yeah.
induce feelings of like happiness or joy or bliss or
Yep.
whatever, and like, if I come out of a sit, I can like easily do this for maybe like 5 or 10 minutes or maybe for like an hour,
Yep.
but I can't hold on to it for the rest of the day. And I
Right.
assume that's a function of how well you can actually manipulate your mind or like master your mind. And I
Yes.
would suspect that the population or like the cohort of subjects you have for this experiment are probably going to be like randomly sampled from like, the general
Yep.
population.
Yeah.
And they might not really have a very good control over their mind. And
Yep.
so even if like hypothetically one of these groups were to have some efficacy, like you would learn more about how well they control their mind and not about the efficacy itself because it
Right.
is a placebo thing.
Interesting. Yeah. 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 No, well, that's actually also an interesting point. And this is the trouble with psychology studies and anything, especially if you're going into the hypnosis and placebos. There's so many different moving parts.
Hmm.
I'm not attached to this design. This is just sort of what the sort of working thing at the moment, and I'm very open to change it and refine it. But I think the key here, right, is that, I mean, there's two things. We could take a group of people. We could hit up, all the meditation QRI people. Be like, yo, we're doing this. Like, they're gonna probably have an easier time than the average person, potentially, right? Than someone that's never had any meditative, psychedelic, or cognitive practices ever before. Like, they may not respond in the same way, right? And that's gonna be a bias sample, but it's gonna be interesting because I'm interested, in the very least, that you could, in whatever population of people it could be, that it's possible that you could have this kind of prompt in your head and you can induce this feeling. Now on the case of how long and what, the lasting of these effects is, yeah, for some people, this is another individual variance kind of thing. Some people will drink the same amount of coffee, and it will last shorter or longer for some people. And sometimes it even pulses. They'll feel a dip, then it comes back, and it's very, very complex. Um, and I think the way to sort of to measure this is to be like, okay, let's just measure what their initial response to caffeine actually is, right, at baseline, and then we'll just see if they can replicate that through the prompt, right? So if their caffeine only lasts them, they only get, let's just say 10 minutes of really good energy, 30 minutes of really good energy, whatever, that would be our kind of reference point. Right now, the
Yeah.
end goal, of course, is like, okay, can we have the benefits of caffeine, for the whole day, and then we can turn it off when we want to and go to sleep? That's, a study for another time, potentially, a very interesting future one. But I think an interesting way to do this is to just tie it to what their actual experience with caffeine is. So if it only lasts half an hour or an hour for them, or a couple hours, and we can measure, the dips in energy, which is maybe, I don't know if EEG will be helpful for that. I was thinking about that. Um, as long as we can quantify those things and we can see if the end thing matches to that, at least we can say there's something happening. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
A baseline, and then is it replicable, or what changes
Is the
relative to it?
baseline
Yeah.
replicable? Yeah, when they're on
Yeah, I
caffeine,
think that's fine. I think an interesting point will be, caffeine has sort of the dependency, the negative side effects of it too.
yes.
But I know that's you thinking about that down the road.
Well, no, I mean, on one hand, we can embrace that and be like, hey, the end goal is not even about the positive effects. It's just that, can you get the effects of caffeine and condition it to a prompt and a set of words and a
Well, the
mantra.
positive effects,
Well,
you
you
want the
want the
positive
positive
effects,
effects,
not the
but
negative
but it
byproduct.
would be interesting. Two sides of this. It'd be interesting where we almost don't tell people what to focus on, right?
Yeah,
It would
the
be very
double
interesting to
blinding
just
it
see
out. Yeah.
exactly. We don't tell them what to focus on about the caffeine. They're just drinking it and whatever they're immediately able to pick up on and notice, which
Well,
is an interesting glimpse into their mind subjectively. And that's what they train on, right?
and
And there's
it
some
would
people
be
that drink coffee to feel tired and relaxed.
it would be really interesting to be able to do almost like two different like tangential experiments
Yeah.
where one you don't say anything, another you're very intentional about
Mm-hmm. Yep.
we want you to focus explicitly on the mental,
Exactly.
that'd be really cool. Yeah.
Exactly. And it would be interesting to establish in another kind of baseline is what are the things that people are immediately more easily able to grab onto, and versus what they have to explicitly be told and trained on, right? Because one of the goals with this, the longer term goals is, okay, you're going to take, you know, a painkiller, you're going to take caffeine, you're going to take modafinil, Adderall, whatever, and you want to filter for the effects that you want versus the things that you don't want. And then you can basically memorize and store these things as kinds of, trigger words and prompts and things inside of your head, or visuals or whatever it is. And then you can combine it with other, pharmaceuticals or substances. So some people will combine stimulants with things like THC or whatever to get a certain kind of effect. They want focus, but they want something a little bit wider. And so they'll take some of these things together. And imagine if you could just memorize these things, and just like how you can use two different words and combine them to create a new one, two different letters to combine and create a new one, so on, for colors and images, yada yada. You can do this with substances inside of your head, where your mind is the pharmacy, and you can mix it in different ways. I don't think people are good. I would imagine 99% of people are not able to do this by default. I think this is probably a very, very trained skill that you have to do. And the only people who probably would be able to know how to do this are like very, very, very advanced meditators. Um, which is another reason I actually want to study this in them, even if it's just like 5 people, because that will also give a glimpse into sort of the edge cases, right?
Yeah.
So, I don't know.
To, just saying this verbally here and in chat later, there's something very specifically about profiling and documenting some things about your users that I would
Yeah.
like to follow up on, because I think
Yeah.
will be critical and something to handle with care, and also
Give me
very
a TLDR on it.
appealing. Basically, I think a lot when you talk about we're talking about the future stuff. Wait, what did you just say? Sorry, I might have
I
missed
said
it.
no. Yeah, tell me. Give me the TLDR. What you were thinking.
TLDR is about, I think, implicitly what you're going to turn up if you handle designating and demarcating the differences that we're talking about here will be very valuable to certain things in the head, certain things in the future. And I'll follow up on that later.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
Please do. Anybody else? Questions, comments, criticism?
I had a thought right now.
Go.
I'm wondering if it would be, like, from an experimental perspective, if it
Mm-hmm.
would be interesting to decouple this into, like, or disentangle this into two separate experiments where we
Yeah.
talk about here like the goal is to memorize and remember the preferred effects of caffeine.
Yeah.
But that requires like that sounds really hard, right? Because the user or the subject has to basically figure out what are my preferred effects of caffeine, and
Yes.
then like how do I induce that through like the placebo or whatever.
Right.
Instead, I wonder if you could have a first initial experiment that
Yeah.
just gets the user to replicate their usual effect of caffeine, right?
Right.
So whatever that
Right.
is, like you kind
Yeah.
of induce that
Yeah.
using the
That's a
same
good one.
method because it should work theoretically, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that should have like some measurable like effects
Hmm.
that you can like quantify. Like for example, like if you drink caffeine or if you take caffeine like, at like 4 p.m., you're probably going to have
Right.
a higher like elevated resting heart rate before bed,
Right.
right? And so
Yep.
now you can measure like the resting heart rate before bed and compare it to their baseline, which is like what they would
Yeah.
have if they usually take caffeine at 4 p.m., right? And then do the same thing maybe if they do like 2 p.m. versus like 10 a.m., whatever. And so now you can actually see if like these groups actually work, period, right?
Right.
And the second one would be saying, okay, hey, we see that, group 4 and group 5 have higher efficacy than like the other ones. Maybe we can get the users to come back and be like, now can you try to replicate just the preferred effects versus
Right. Right. Right.
your effects, period.
Well, actually these are all good points, and I'll add another thing too about like I had another friend, uh, who I'd shown this to, and he was like, you should just forget about caffeine, actually drinking the caffeine entirely and just do it through words and visuals, right? Because that's textbook hypnosis, right? And we there's
That's
a
interesting. Yeah.
there's the famous stuff about hypnosis about making people feel drunk and high and that stuff does work, by the way. I don't know if any of you have tried
Yeah.
it. That does actually work.
I
That
was
is a
planning to see
very
that
real thing.
at the Augmentation Lab Summit. Like that was
Yeah,
like,
yeah. And there's even more complicated versions of that than even the one that was done, but like it's
yeah.
very interesting. um and I always look at the kinds of protocols and techniques athletes use to recover, sleep, feel energetic. I look at I always give the example of there's Mike Tyson on the street, and there's Mike Tyson in the ring that will kill you. And they're two different characters. And
Mhm.
he's talked for a long time about like how he's created this other sense of self, the beast character Mike Tyson. And then he had trouble separating that from his original
Yes.
self.
Yeah.
Actors go through the same thing, performers, athletes. This is not a new concept in the slightest. And I think one thing to phrase this here as well, to reframe this, is that you're creating Jess baseline, Jess on caffeine, or Jess on metformin or modafinil or whatever, right? And you should be able to draw a line between those two things so you can toggle it. But the next question then is that not only do we want to toggle it on and off, but we want to sort of have a volume switch on it. Can we turn it up? Can we turn it down? Right? And each of those things could sort of induce and infer and produce their own kinds of effects. Um, but yeah, I feel like there's very interesting stuff there about just skipping the 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 compound thing altogether, because if this hypnosis, language synesthesia, placebo, whatever it is, has any merit, then theoretically, at least for a lot of things, you should be able to just use language and perception alone to do it without having to actually take the substance, right?
Or, if I may,
Yes.
or a very, very, very slight
Right.
required
Yeah,
iteration of
some
the actual
nudge.
physical
Yeah.
process. For example, I don't think it's just going to be a matter of, and maybe I'd be very fascinated to test this to see if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
I don't think you're just going to be able to meditate and grow like
No.
gigantic muscles and lose your body fat.
Yeah, I
But
don't think it's
maybe
just
you
gonna
just
happen like that.
require a much smaller amount of effort to trigger the
Yeah.
thing and amplify the response. Or like
Yes.
thinking about across developmental stages, it might work a lot better if you're already
Right.
a teen growing at a certain rate. You have to kind of
Yes.
deal with the existing structures that play, but it's like, what
Right.
is that line? What is the ceiling there?
Yes.
Yeah, that's the
This
cool
this
stuff.
is this is a good point. And the example I always come back to when I think about this, right, is I think about, okay, um, you know, even though Alon will disagree about world models, but let's just say you are building a world model. You're
Right.
building this sort of internal representation of things, right? So when you're young, when Jess, when Dugan, Michael, Sajith, when you guys are young, and you don't necessarily know much about the world, well, what are you going to do? You're going to experiment. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to experiment, and that's going to take time and energy and resources. These are risks, right? But if you sort of build up enough of a model of that inside of your head, Well, you don't have to touch your hand on the stove to know it's going to burn you. You don't have to drive 100 miles an hour into a tree to know what's going to happen to you,
Mhm.
right? You don't even have. In fact, you don't even have to see somebody drive 100 miles an hour into a tree or a pole to know
Right.
what's going to happen.
Never
As a reference,
experience it, never observe it. No.
exactly. Now imagine that carried over to this, where these substances are stored as words, as visuals, as symbols and
Hmm.
signs and all of that. And you have this kind of phenomenological memory, a phenomenological alphabet and language inside of your head. And just how you can, simulate and combine these different experiences without having to actually physically do it, you can just do it inside of your head. Oh, I
Yeah.
want to modify this qualia of modafinil, this thing of caffeine, this thing of metformin or minoxidil or finasteride or rapamycin or
I,
BBC 157 or Shermorlin or whatever it is you can just kind of do that inside of your head, just like how you can simulate things. This is just more like of an embodied simulation. That's the
so
extreme end of
yeah.
like hyperlanguage.
And I'm doing a little bit of work right now on mapping and
Yep.
navigation,
Interesting.
as like both biological things, but also like epistemic spaces as well. And there's a lot of really cool overlap here in terms of like what, because what I was thinking of like, oh, there's also a very profound ethical or relational component to that
Yep.
as well. I know it's not what we're focusing on here, but if you
Sure.
can, the it goes back to the perception, the what's part of your body type of thing. There's sort of like the lines about what other people and external things are in that sense are very interesting too. So we can talk about that later. I'm sure
Yeah.
you want to go on with stuff, but yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts, especially on the experimental design for caffeine, and then potential future experiments, things to consider. I'm all ears.
Not
The,
sure if I missed this, but did you mention what the bioprompts would be?
Okay, so this is a good one. The bioprompts. So the key here is one of the things I want to do to differentiate this is I want it to be like a biological passcode. Whatever prompt that they're using to condition the caffeine, it needs to literally be like a password. Like they're not going to randomly think about it or see it anywhere else or hear it. It's going to be so complex that when they memorize it with the caffeine, um, it's going to be so tightly tied to it that they're not going to really see it anywhere else. So it's literally going to the prompt will literally look like a passcode with a bunch of numbers and letters and all these things. It's going to literally be um, this sort of memorizable passcode that you have to remember each time you say it. And that's important because if you have a set of words or phrases or stimuli that you see all the time, it's much harder to create that strong association. All right. So the prompt has to be extremely unique. It's going to be unique to each person, even if the structure is the same. Um, and that's sort of the way the prompt is going to be designed, at least for this one that we want to do. Right. In the future, it'd be interesting to just use normal words alone, hypnosis style. But for this one, it's literally going to be like a passcode that they have to memorize, and they will say this, 3 times or whatever each time that they drink their coffee. And part of this also is I do want to see what they sort of naturally gravitate to, right? Because I think some people are naturally more attentive to certain things, and maybe we toss in a thing about saying this prompt, and then we give them a couple pointers about think about the feeling of energy and this and that each time that they do it, right? But that's what the prompt would look like, literally like a passcode.
it,
Do you think it should be designed differently?
No, I think that makes sense.
Okay.
The thought I had was that it sounds like we're like inventing mantras from first principles. It's kind of funny.
This is why I said prayer is placebo and all that kind of stuff before is these I think these are all kind of one and the same deep.
Yeah, I think of all of them as like tools of focus, like somewhere to
Yeah.
put your concentration so that you can get
Hmm.
whatever the intended effect is.
Yep.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
which brings like, if this is like a passcode, is something like a mantra, then
Yeah.
you can, modulate, or you can it can sound kind of musically, or maybe it
Right.
sounds like if you change the tone of your voice, whatever the timbre,
Yeah.
it can induce different effects. Who knows?
Yeah, and it's interesting the far transfer effects if we go back to the simulation thing I was saying earlier about like yeah, you don't have to see the car hitting the pole to know what's going to happen. Um and you don't have to necessarily I think what'll eventually happen is, let's say you train on a handful of different substances, or to use language in this way, is eventually, well, you don't actually have to use, you don't have to basically use um, the substances anymore. You can just use the existing words to infer and produce a new one, right? You don't have to actually have experienced a thing or even something too similar to it to produce it, right? Like, I don't have to have experienced a new word before for me to create a brand new word in my head by combining the letters and things in a different way. And I think the same thing is possible. Again, does this mean you can do anything and everything? I don't know, but you can definitely do something. I could say that with more confidence. Um, but yeah, that's where my head is at with this. I think this is basically prayer, mantra, ritual from first principles. Because I was just, when I
Right.
came up with this, I was just thinking about this stuff in my head and just thinking about everyday things. I wasn't reading a whole bunch of papers initially, or looking at religious texts and all these things. And you know my sort of dive into Buddhism and meditation came after this, right? And it was part of the reason I got interested in meditation and all that kind of stuff. So
It,
it's very interesting to come at it from a very different angle and still arrive at the same
it,
conclusion.
it's sort of the work of much more rigorous uh takes on, you could say prayer, you can say law of attraction, you can
Yeah.
say meditation, like all of the things in that
Right.
category. Yeah. My last comment about experimental stuff is, I would be very interesting, and this could be a much extended conversation elsewhere, but I'd be very curious for you to know of the people you're doing the experiment on, their
Yeah.
pre-existing exposure to things like mindfulness or whatever else. And I would say there's a lot you could survey them about, but probably do that after. You don't want to prime them too much with that, you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
you can't prime them too much. That's a very important part.
So I'd be really curious, and that's related to some of the data stuff I was talking about before too. But like I just thinking about this playing straight myself is like, I wonder if someone, like, what are the degrees that the impact you're looking for can be associated with, or kind of related to a lot of structures. And like, if someone is very fluent internally, if you will, in the phenomenological language, or understanding some of the interoceptive stuff, if someone's like very, very high fluency in that, would they be
Mhm.
able to more easily do this or not? Or
Yeah.
and what are the sort of the degrees of what that
Yeah.
is? You know what I mean? So
Well, this is one of those things where we just haven't really studied it enough
exactly.
about
Yeah.
the ties between all these things. And yeah, I could sort of thought experiment out in my head and give you some ideas and predictions, but we won't really have a more precise idea until the experiments are done. But if I had to make a bet on it, I would say, like, yeah, I would say that you know if someone is a generally more advanced meditator, especially they've gone through the jhanas and all that kinds of stuff, and or they're very experienced with psychedelics, I would even reach into this and say people who are naturally good actors, and stuff like that will be better at these kinds of things. One of the things that David Spiegel would talk about, the professor at Stanford, on hypnosis, is like one of the telltale signs that somebody's more hypnotically suggestible is, do they get lost in a conversation, lost in a movie, lost while listening to music, and everything else just sort of blends into their mode of focus.
Interesting. Yeah.
Right. I'll send some links to that because I actually want to do a salon with him when I come back to SF.
This is a point that came much earlier that I
Yeah.
remember, just to say it. Um, there could be a variation in the experiment or whatever, but just um, what maybe not this experiment, the caffeine one directly, but just it'd
Yeah.
be really interesting to me to see another way to get at some of the core stuff you're talking about, is sort of like not just someone's ability to do the thing, but sort of
Right.
how they would recover from a related perturbation, or like not zero setting, but like um creating a perturbation that precedes the thing you want to do, not to try to zero set the perturbation, but to see because like the really important things you need to know, like for example, maybe you meet someone who's a really has a great phenomenological language or
Yeah.
whatever experience,
Yeah.
but they're burnt out. They're
Hmm.
chronologically burnt out, or didn't get good sleep, or they're dealing with
Yeah.
something else in life. Like that
Yeah.
totally affects their capacity on
It
the test,
does. It
you
does.
know? So
And
it's
and
like,
even for me, like days where I'm just feeling so out of it, like normally I've trained on the caffeine thing, but sometimes it's a little hard to do it. Like I can't get into that
right,
headspace, right?
right.
And
and
it's
that
just
would
like with any other thought, though. Like there's just certain times where I can't put in the cognitive effort. I'm just kind of out of it or whatever. I don't know.
and that was sort of the other point was
Yeah.
like if you're take like doing something when someone's in a perfectly calm equanimous state and this is why a lot of like psychological testing is kind of crap because they'll put you in a lab space that's really sterile and try to have you
Right.
be uniform, all that kind of stuff, you know. And so it's like how do you account for, you know, getting there's sort of this weird amount of how much pre-training can you do to normalize people's ability to be in a somewhat similar like pre-event state.
Yeah.
Um
Yeah.
that's
This
hard.
is an
So
interesting
yeah.
one. Because on one hand, I was talking to someone and we're like, we could, if there's an existing substance or something that makes you more hypnotically suggestible and receptive, can you condition and train on that ironically? Or is
Mhm.
there a prompt that makes you more hypnotically suggestible? Right? That's another interesting one is can you be kind of meta about it and go one layer above? And I think that is possible. I think if all of this other stuff is possible, then so is that you can design a prompt that is naturally going to make somebody more receptive. And if you think about the process of what hypnosis is doing, you know, when you get people into that sort of state of mind, you're already doing that. You're already doing that. And now, if you want to enhance the effects, you want to take it a step further, but you're already doing that. If you and I are talking right now and I start giving you some, patterns of words and sounds and prompts to get you into a more hypnotically suggestible state, I'm already doing that. Yeah, maybe some of the structure is already there for it, but I'm not utilizing it until I expose you to the stimuli, which is getting you into that state. And then the question is, can you amplify that more? Right? And I think it's very interesting that maybe the ultimate interface for programming biology is not through a bunch of injections and all those things, but maybe it's through the mind, this thing that we call the mind and perception and language. And I mean that in a very literal sense that you can use language to program biology, just as you use it to program, a computer. Um, and
it it's
Go ahead.
certainly our most like it is, you know, it's the thing that outside of an actual physical presence of a
Sure.
face,
Right.
it's the thing that because there are ways you could do this where it's because you don't have the articulatory power of words. But if you were to have certain physical or social,
Yeah.
like the biggest in trainers are other physical things too. But then
Yeah.
in the world of like the logical structures, yeah, language is the thing that's going to
Yeah.
do it, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what was I going to say about that? I think my comment was I had a comment, but it was separate from that, so we
Yeah.
can. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I think Dugan, any thoughts? You've been pretty quiet today.
Yeah, I mean, one thing about the pregnancy,
Yeah.
the false pregnancy, I
Yeah.
think that it might be going the other way. Like the person
Yeah.
believes that they're pregnant because their body went through the subroutine of like we're
Right.
having a baby, and like
Right.
you get
Yeah.
all this
Yeah.
physiological programming that
Hmm.
for one reason or another got triggered,
Right.
and
It's the
then and
evidence
then
they need. Yeah.
yeah. And
Yeah.
then the mind is a byproduct of like the body telling the mind that the body's pregnant.
Yeah. So as I also understand on the pregnancy thing is that like, yeah, this will occur in people that had been pregnant before, or people that maybe were pregnant and then they had a miscarriage or all these kinds of things. I think there's different kinds of things where it's like, yeah, something will put you into that thing directly. But I also recall that there were very specific cases where the act of just thinking that they were pregnant, and there was enough context around them, the people around them. It's like this weird kind of gaslighting thing, and eventually they start to feel
Hmm.
that, right? Which is again textbook
Hmm.
hypnosis and placebo. So again, this is a question on the ceiling effects, as I think there are lines in the sand, but they can be rewritten. You can move the sand over and dissolve the line and move it elsewhere or whatever. Um, and these examples were just sort of to set the stage as to what might be possible, what seems to be possible right now, right? But the pregnancy thing is, I also, if we're going to dig into it further, I want to have more objective measures as what are these things that are happening, because it's not super well studied as far as I understand, right?
It's
So
it,
so all of these things we need more studies and big if true, right? That's the summation of all of this. Um,
and one final thing, if I
Yeah.
can. What would be really cool, like long term, like you want to talk about revolutionizing health, minus the pharmacy. I think what you're getting, and this is related to what I was saying about a
Yeah.
lot of individual differences and so on. Long term, what you're going to bump up against, and if you handle this the right way, you can sort of generate a what we all know the degree of things missing the gap. Like
Sure.
psychology, the DSM, medical stuff right now, it's
Right.
incomplete. We're in a very incomplete
Yeah.
world. We have a very expertise about very narrow
Yeah.
things, and it's great. But a lot of what you're doing is like if you handle it the right way, you can
Right.
get at like these are the things in
Yeah.
that are relegated to like holistic stuff sometimes
Yep.
or naturally, and there's there are other words for it, but like the things that if you're giving someone medication, but the kind of entrainments and regulatory things you're getting at are a contradiction to it, that might be
Right.
why the pills and the medication themselves don't work too. So
Yes.
if you
Yeah.
can combine both, it would get the more sense
Good
of
point.
all the stuff together. We have a
Yep.
very, 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 very poor sense of
Yeah.
legitimate rigor about what's working internally for someone. So I
Yeah.
think this could address a lot of that if it's handled the right way too.
Yeah. And this is one of those things where we have to quantify perception and language, right? I guess we're already kind of doing that to a
We,
degree, but
we,
it's go ahead.
Yeah, I mean that's that we're going back to I appreciate the use of like phenomenological language. Like
Yeah.
we that it's the space that's been neglected for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
Like it's there was a very intentional separation and why? Because it's hard. I think people I'm always love the example like if you hold your cell phone in your hand, there's a reason why the cell phone in your hand works. There's a reason why we
Yep.
could send something to Mars and back
Yep.
and it works.
Yep.
And we haven't done that with some of the internal stuff. And the
Yep.
reality is, in a very particular way, it's because the internal stuff is harder than all that.
Yeah.
Like the focus on doing it and accounting for all the variables is much different. It breaks symmetries in
Yeah.
different ways. Like that matters. So
Yeah.
it is hard work, but it's important work, and I think we
It's
can do
important
that.
work. Exactly. It's, and the important things are hard.
Yeah,
I always say it
it's the
makes
work left to be done. Like it's what
exactly.
we have to do. So yeah, go on.
Exactly. Um, yeah, I mean, I guess if I had to wrap it up in my own words with all this kind of stuff, I mean, this is so early. This is just the beginning. We're not even on the tip of the iceberg, in my opinion, right? Um, and if this has the validity and merit that I truly believe that it does, I think the world will look very different. It's not going to just be medicine. I almost want to abstain from using revolutionizing medicine and all. I don't even think about it that way. I just think about it as how do we relate to each other in the environment in a
Yeah,
more deep way. And I mean that very literally too. Um, and I think it'll change a lot of it'll change the way we use language, obviously, because once if you open yourself up to this kind of suggestibility, you need some kind of cognitive immune system as well, which is
absolutely.
again topic for another time. I think I've talked
Will
about a little
Hunt,
bit
yeah.
before. Yep, there you go, Mr. Wilhan, along
Shout out
there,
to Will. Yeah,
bringing got both of them on my shoulders right here, and I think what I can more concretely say is, look, I think the caffeine, painkiller, I think some peptide related stuff, growth hormone. I think the things that the body is already very familiar with, either because you've consumed it a lot or it already knows how to make it, those will be much more easier to do. Now, if you're trying to get the effect of minoxidil, which is your body isn't producing minoxidil, it's sort of a trigger to produce other responses in response to
Mm,
other things. That's less direct, but I think it's still very possible. And we know from literally skin and hair placebo trials that there is still sometimes effects where these things do something, even if it's a fake pill. And again, the other thing is that I think even if these things work, are they going to be the same as the exact medication? Are they going to be less? Um, I'm not sure. If I had to be very honest about what I think, is that I think even if things start off kind of small and it's not the same effect as a medication, I'm willing to bet you could train to get to that point. I think whatever obstacle that we're going to run up against here is that training will very likely solve it, or at least help a lot. Now, training is just training on different techniques. Do we, use some different biofeedback things, which is a whole nother thing to get into. Um, is I think no matter what, there's going to be ways to get this kind of effect. Like, have we actually tried biofeedback for a bunch of crazy different things? Like, we actually haven't. We've used it for stuff, and we have interesting information, but there's so much more we could do with that in the context of this whole placebo hypnosis language thing. right?
Mhm.
That we have not even tried. I'm telling you right now, I'm willing to bet if the mirror touch synesthesia and the phantom limb stuff has any merit, which I think it does, I am willing to bet we could take Jess. Let's just say, you had a, let's just say you had a bad bruise on your face, or you had let's
Just
just
had a
let's just
terrible looking face. But yeah,
let's
go
just
ahead.
say you had a rhinoplasty, you had a nose job, right? Since we want to appeal to cosmetic people here, right? Let's just say you had a rhinoplasty. I
Yeah.
probably need it more than you, right? But let's just say you have one, okay?
Yeah.
And you look at a sort of artificial mirror that is recording you, whatever, and in real time, it's making your face gradually every day look a little bit better, more so than it would normally, right? So you have to. It's going to be tough to establish a baseline. You can only use
I would,
existing.
if you ever do something like that for acne scarring, the microneedling, I have terrible
I'm
acne
willing
scars
to
on my
bet this
face.
is very
I would
possible, and
join
I
it. I will join
well,
that
I'm
circle.
down. And maybe the way to keep the ball rolling and the momentum going is that we can't always put together super big studies, but we can do smaller ones that are high signal enough
Yeah.
that we can use it. So I'd be totally down to do stuff on acne scars and all of that. I'm willing to bet with this that just by having this thing where you're convinced that that's who you are, it will naturally start to happen like what happens with the phantom limb,
So,
right?
and a perfect segment is something else. I think the ability to have agency about that, the ability to feel the precursor to what you're saying about being able to be convinced, I think that's huge and a huge, for lack of better terms, ethical space about a lot of things going forward too. So yes, I think there's a lot there beyond just both materializing and then this sense of oneself being able to materialize it at all. But that's
Yeah.
a tangent. So yeah.
So, anyways, all right, I have to dip, but this was a lot of fun. I'm glad I got to talk about this a bit more.
Yeah,
Had
good to
stuff on
hear from you
YouTube.
in this capacity. Looking
Yeah,
forward to
this
it.
so this is my focus. This and the vision stuff is now my main thing,
Your
my full time
lane.
thing. Yeah.
Good.
So it's going to involve going around, being a salesperson, getting funding, finding participants, which I also, if anyone else, that's interested, I'm all ears. That's wants to be a participant because you can't have experiments without participants. Um, and then also just publicizing this, which
Yeah.
is fun for me because I love to yap. So it's very natural. So if anyone is very interested, if they're doing events or anything, I'm already speaking at one uh, in Cambridge in I think in May 12th or something. There's a meditation and biological
Oh yeah.
adjacent event. I think Zach is his name that's running it. He's got
Okay.
Michael Levin speaking there as well. I think Alon is going
Oh,
to hop.
cool. Is that the one? Is that Lucas thing or is that separate?
I
Tell me
think
about it
Luca
later.
is related to it in some context. I don't know if he's specifically involved, but um, yeah, it is
It,
the Innovations in Biological Intelligence and Machine Agency.
okay.
Yeah, that one. So cool
I
stuff
should,
is happening. Um, and each time I talk, things will refine themselves and all that. But every time I look into this, I always just find more weird examples or anecdotes, and I'm like, this is way more than even I originally thought. Which is saying something because I feel like I was initially kind of dramatic about it, but I'm still even finding more examples, and I'm like, what the heck? So I don't know.
is it the World Conference or what
No,
was
no,
a
no, no.
different event?
This
We'll
is
talk
something
about
else.
it later.
Yeah, we'll talk
Yeah.
about it later. But
But
Cambridge.
yeah, cool stuff. And like, I don't think it's quite there yet, but when you're doing, yeah, we'll talk about it later. This is great. This is a lot of fun to
Yeah,
talk
I
this.
hope this is decent enough of a start to get that ball rolling.
I
Um,
think so.
and the goal also is like I don't want to be the only one doing this. Like if it's interesting enough, it should naturally inspire others to think about trying this, even if they're just thinking about it themselves or actually running experiments. Like I would love to see that happen because it's not just going to only be me. These things
Mhm.
are never one person. So
Great.
good stuff. Thank you, everyone. Pleasure. Appreciate the time as always.
Yeah, great
Dugan,
to hear from
Michael, Luca,
everybody again and
Jess.
looking forward to more of these ahead.